One of my favorite pastimes, both in childhood and then as a teenager and well into my 20s, was fishing. And typically I would use a spinning or bait casting rod and reel. And I really got started into that by going fishing with my dad when I was pretty young, probably 4 or 5 years old. We got started. And I'm going to tell you a story about a fish that we caught that was almost a state record white bass in just a few. But I want to give you a little bit of background about my dad and his dad and fishing and all of that sort of stuff. So it's clear that fishing was something important not just for my dad and me as a kid, but it was something that was passed on from his own father taking him fishing. And my grandpa, I never knew him this way, but previous to his retirement, he was a pretty busy guy and he'd worked his way up through the corporate ladder. He eventually became like a major consultant for the Glidden Corporation and did all sorts of stuff. And so he made time to spend time with my dad, who was actually his second son. He'd have a previous son in an earlier marriage where he divorced and actually didn't have too much to do with his son until much, much later on. But my dad was the only child with my grandmother, and my grandpa kind of spoiled him, in part because he could. And part of that was taking him fishing. And they did a lot of cool fishing trips together. We have photographs of them up in Canada where you had to fly in and get a guide and they'd go muskie and pike fishing. And that was something that my own dad wanted for me, and to a lesser extent, I think my sister, who was not quite as interested in fishing, and I don't think she and him had that kind of bond. And so, early on, my dad taught me how to fish, and he would take me fishing. So some of my earliest memories are of going out on Lake Nagawicka, waking up really early in the morning when it was still dark, and we would, drive to the bait shop with the two rods that we had, which are very, very nice bait casting rods, beautifully enameled and wonderful reels, and then, these big tackle boxes. And back then we didn't have a boat, so my dad would rent a rowboat, and then we would, row out into the lake. When I say we, he did the rowing, obviously. And we'd have like some sandwiches along and stuff like that. And then we'd fish. And, we spent a lot of time kind of in silence. My dad gave me that line, don't want to talk because the fish will hear and that'll spook them. I think he probably enjoyed the noises of the lake, so to speak, but just hanging out together and catching things, little catfish, panfish of different sorts and all of that. And then, later on down the line, my dad had a good job as a tax attorney, and one of the things that he wanted for us as a family was to have a boat. And so by the time that I was in grade school, and I don't remember exactly what year we got the boat, maybe third grade, he bought this tri-hull 18-footer, and we christened it the Green Arrow, and we were out on mostly Lake Nagawicka, and then we'd take river trips. And I've talked about this in some other of my stories as well. And we actually did a river trip one time down the Mississippi with 2 other boats and families, and that was a lot of fun for about a week. But in any case, we would spend a lot of time out on Lake Nagawicka as a family, and we would, get, inner tubes and air mattresses and swim and get pulled behind and, have lunch and sometimes even dinner out there and, putter around the lake, and we would fish. We would often go by the island and fish for perch, or we would go to other places. But here's where we get to the story about this white bass. There's a part of Lake Nagawicka that's called the Kettle, and it's its own little bubble of the lake, and there's kind of a narrow channel that attaches it to the lake. And it's full of marsh and kind of blends off into the marshlands around that area. And that's a great place to fish, or at least it was back then. And so quite often my dad and I would, on a Saturday morning or, sometimes like after school when he wasn't working too late, he'd come home and he'd be like, pack up the boat, we're going to go fishing for a while. And so then, we drive out there and we put the boat in. He had a station wagon and a trailer, and he'd have to go park it, and I'd be holding the boat, waiting for him. Sometimes in the mornings, he'd actually like drive off to the nearby, and when I say nearby, like a couple miles away, McDonald's, and get us some Egg McMuffins and hash browns, and come back, and we'd go out and fish. So we did this a lot, him and me, and we would fish with all sorts of things: minnows, worms, hellgrammites, which are dragonfly larvae, wax worms, and we would catch all sorts of interesting stuff. So anyway, it was, in the middle of the fall, I remember that, and it was kind of a gray, drizzly day, and it was, I was a day that I, came home from school, and I think maybe my dad had come home early, and he was like, let's go out to the lake. Let's go fishing. And I was like, that sounds great, because I love fishing, So anyway, we pack up, we get down there, we go out to the Kettle, and, it's raining a little bit. It's kind of gray, it's kind of cold, and we're catching, things here and there, some bluegill. Every once in a while you might hook into something a little bit bigger. And then, interestingly enough, now I didn't actually hook this fish. My dad did. So I've got one rod, he's got another one. They were red and green, I remember that, beautifully enameled, almost like high-end bait casting rods and reels. And so anyway, we're sitting there, and he gets a bite, and of course you gotta set the hook, right? So he does that. And you see the rod bending down. Now, these were some fairly heavy rods. These, later on, I got myself a spinning setup with a light, and I also had an ultralight rod so that, even a bluegill would pull it down quite a bit. These were a little bit stiffer. You could use these for bass fishing or even for pike fishing or walleye fishing. And so I see it going down, and he's like, here, take this. I'll take your rod. You play the fish. I want to see how you do this. So I start doing it, and at first I was actually, I'd read about big fish and stuff like that, and I was like, well, they need to take the line, right? So, and I'm going to like hit the thing that will release the line. He's like, no, don't do that. Just let it pull with the drag. Now fight the fish, And so it's about a good, 3-4 minutes before we actually can see the fish coming over. And it's not huge by today's standards, but when you're a 4th grader, a 9-year-old, it looks pretty damn big. So I see this fish, and its mouth is like this big, and it's wide open, and I get it close, and finally he's got, the net, and he swings it under and pulls it in, and it's a white bass. Beautiful, striped, right? And it's pretty big. And he's looking at it, and he's like, that's a damn big white bass. And I was like, how big is it? And he's like, well, we better go find out, because this fish here, this might be something kind of special. So we get it in, and we've, got the I forget what we call those, the stringer through its gills, and we're keeping it in water. And my dad, we pull the anchor up and put the rods and reels down, and we start heading across the lake, because we got to go out of the Kettle and all the way across the lake to where we used to rent the rowboats and stuff like that, because there are docks there, and the docks are right across from these bars. And these bars are fishermen bars, right? So people would, have some beers and then go fishing, or they'd come back and have some beers and hang out. And my dad says, well, I'm going to go in. You stay here at the boat, and I'm going to go in with the fish, and we'll get some measurements. We'll get it weighed. We'll get it measured, too, how long it is. So he comes back after about 10 minutes, and he says, well, I got some good news, and I got some bad news. And he says, the good news is this is a really big white bass. Congratulations on catching it. I'm so proud of you for doing that, and so much fun to do together. Unfortunately, it's not a record. I thought it might be, actually, but it's actually 1 ounce short of the state record. State record for white bass, I don't know what it was at the time, but whatever it was, we were really, really close to it. And he said everybody at the bar was, looking at it, and they wanted to check it out. And there was a huge sigh of disappointment when it didn't beat the record, And people had these charts that would say what the record were, and they had a scale and all that. And my dad, I remember this to this day. He was like, you know what I should have done? I should have dropped a couple sinkers down its gullet before we took it in to weigh it. But that wouldn't have been the right thing to do, And he was kind of like wavering back and forth about that. And so he said, well, it's still a really big fish. We're going to take it home and figure out what to do with it, and that'll be pretty cool. And I was like, are we gonna eat it tonight? And he's like, I don't know if this is an eaten fish or not. So long story short, we take a picture of it. We actually had a picture that we took, I remember this, in front of our refrigerator. And then within about a week, my dad must have had it developed and then sent in the story. There was actually a story with that picture, little blurb about me and my dad catching this nearly state record white bass in Lake Nagawicka in the local paper, the Waukesha Freeman. And it was kind of funny because I was like not quite a celebrity, but it certainly put me on notice at my little elementary school. Everyone's like, oh, I saw the story about you and the fish and all that. I've subsequently gone back and tried to find it, and it's not there online. Maybe it's available in microfiche somewhere, and I probably should track it down because it was kind of a cool thing to happen. But there's me in front of the refrigerator holding up this big white bass. And I thought that was the end of the story, but it actually wasn't. Because unbeknownst to me, around Christmas time, there's a big package for me under the tree. I would say 18 inches by 18 inches by 18 inches, like a big cube wrapped up. And I was like, what could that be? Some presents you could figure out right away. So anyway, we're all opening our Christmas presents, and I open this up, and I look down, and there's all this tissue paper, and I'm like, what the hell is this, right? So I start pulling all of it out, and there it is. There's my fish mounted by a taxidermist on a block of wood, and I think it might even said something on the plaque, but I don't remember. I've long since lost that, unfortunately. I carried it with me from place to place, and I would hang it because that was like my one big fish trophy, And it wasn't a huge fish, but it was pretty sizable, like this big. And the taxidermist had done a pretty good job on it. And so, that was kind of a cool thing, a memento, because, unfortunately, my dad was not going to live that much longer after that. And I'll tell you about that in just a bit. There is one other part of the story that I do have to tell you, and that is that they estimated that the fish was probably like 18 to 20 years old, so it had been there a very long time, and it had had the opportunity to grow quite a bit. And they did save the meat, and so we had the meat, and it was terrible. It tasted what I imagine the bottom of the lake probably tasted like. I don't know if that was because it was, just a very old fish or because they hadn't preserved it just right, but we ended up throwing it out, which was kind of unfortunate. But, cool nonetheless that we'd gone to all of that effort and trouble. So, I continued fishing for a very long time. I haven't done it for quite a long time, although I still do have a rod and reel in storage, and it's mostly because of not finding the time. I tried getting my own children interested in fishing, and I succeeded a bit with my oldest child, but it didn't really stick. But my dad got the fishing bug stuck with me. And, he had the intention eventually of taking me up to Canada on the kind of trips that his dad had taken him on. We did manage to go on a few longer trips up to Eagle River, for example. I remember that was when I was about 10 or so. So like probably, later that year or the next year. And unfortunately, my dad died in the summer of 1982 when he was only 36 and I was 11. So obviously we didn't fish anymore after that. But I continued fishing. By then we had sold our boat to one of our neighbors because, without my dad's income, we were in pretty dire straits. And I continued fishing. I would hang out with, neighbor kids or some of my friends. Sometimes those overlapped, and we'd go fishing, right? And I did go on fishing trips with other people and my friends and their dads. And then when I was in college, I'd go fishing in nearby lakes and down in the river as well. And I haven't really done much of it since then, other than when I lived in Indiana and I would take my youngest child and we would go fishing. But anyway, that's kind of a cool story of an almost trophy catch and almost beating the state record. Now, the state record's been beat subsequently. So even if I had achieved a new state record back then, it would have been surpassed by now. But it was a really interesting event in my young life. And I thought I might share that with you, and you might get a kick out of that story. Some of you probably have fishing tales of your own. If you're going to share them, try to keep them, as we say, more or less accurate. Don't turn them into fisherman's yarns. But if you want to share them in your own comments below, that's perfectly fine. So that is it for this story.